Here comes the
It was a
babysitter.
dark and stormy night when the babysitter arrived at the Johnson household. Mrs. Johnson had hired her to watch over her two young children, while she and her husband went out for a rare date night. Little did she know that this decision would lead to a night of terror and tragedy. As the parents left, Mrs. Johnson gave the babysitter strict instructions to put the children to bed by 9 p.m. and not to let anyone into the house. The babysitter nodded obediently, her eyes glinting with a sinister light that Mrs. Johnson failed to notice. As the night wore on, Mrs. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to enjoy her evening out, but a sense of unease gnawed at her. Finally, unable to ignore her instincts any longer, she convinced her husband to leave the restaurant and head back home. When they arrived, they found the front door ajar and the house eerily quiet. Mrs. Johnson's heart pounded in her chest as she raced up the stairs to check on her children. What she found in their room made her blood run cold. The babysitter stood over the children's beds, a knife in her hand and a look of madness in her eyes. Mrs. Johnson screamed in horror as the babysitter turned towards her, a twisted smile on her face. In a flash of rage and fear, the babysitter lunged at Mrs. Johnson, plunging the knife into her chest. As Mrs. Johnson's life ebbed away, she made a vow to protect her family from beyond the grave. And so, as the babysitter turned her attention back to the children, a ghostly figure appeared in the room. Mrs. Johnson, now a vengeful spirit, stood between the babysitter and her children, her eyes blazing with fury. The babysitter screamed in terror as Mrs. Johnson's ghostly form reached out to her, her touch icy cold and filled with malice. With a final, blood-curdling scream, the babysitter vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. From that night on, the Johnson household was haunted by the ghost of Mrs. Johnson, who watched over her children with a fierce and protective love. And though the memory of that fateful night lingered like a dark shadow, the family found solace in the knowledge that their mother would always be there to keep them safe from harm.